class, The Devil's Details, here at St. John's Episcopal Church in Laurel, Mississippi. And you'll recall that we have talked about the person of the adversary, the fiend, Satan, Lucifer, why we call him by these various names or titles. We have talked about where this fits within overall, call it systematic theology, and in the theology of prayer, the identity of an incarnate evil. Let's not call him a power of evil, because one of the things we talked about in systematic theology is the lack of the devil having actual power, except to the extent that we give it to him. We went on to talk about developments in church doctrine and the figure of the devil as a type in various forms of literature. Now, 2 classes ago, we went through the devil as he appears in Dante's Divine Comedy. And while we moved to another topic last week, which was more about aspects of diabolical activity in the world, one of our participants, David, brought up particular language from the Divine Comedy. So the way we're going to start tonight is go back to the Divine Comedy and play with it a little bit. And then we're going to move into C.S. Lewis. Let us begin in prayer. The Lord be with you.
And with thy spirit.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as we gather this night, we thank you for the timely rains. We ask that our hearts may ever be grateful for you, that we may be paying attention to you and find you in all aspects of the world around us. Those that are good as blessing, those that trouble us as opportunities to look for you all the more deeply. We ask that as we look, we may never be led astray by any evil being that may tempt us, appearing even as an angel of light. Protect us in all things, this we pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Now, when we talked about Dante, about his rhyming scheme, the way the poem works, that we have a very long poem in 100 complete cantos, and how each canto, well, there are 3 books that each have 33 cantos in them, and each canto has the same number of lines, and then we have one final epilogue canto, so we get 100. There's a numerical scheme throughout. Dante uses a rhyming scheme that is called terza rima, that you can think of as A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, where the first and second line of each 3-line stanza, the ends rhyme with each other. Whatever sound comes in the middle line then becomes the sound of the first line in the next stanza, and we get that rhyming scheme. Once we try to do that in English, we run into some problems. The other thing Dante does is he uses a hendecasyllabic rhyming scheme where lines have 11 syllables. And so you can see the challenges in translation, the same way we would see in biblical poetry from Hebrew, the same way we would see really in any translation. If we're going to try to get close to the meaning in a language that works differently, we're going to end up with some choices we have to make. Are we going to try to make things rhyme using a terza rima scheme or not? Are we going to try to honor the number of syllables in a line or not? I've brought 3 different translations with me tonight. One is kind of my go-to for the quality of the commentary and notes. It is the translation made in the 50s, going into early 60s by the medieval scholar and mystery writer Dorothy Sayers. And Dorothy Sayers makes a specific attempt and succeeds in having a ABA, BCB, a terza rima rhyming scheme. If we start counting syllables, we'll see we don't get an exact 11 syllable scheme. The other one I've brought is by John Ciardi, C-I-A-R-D, who was, at one point was the poet laureate of the United States. And he tries to also do a terza rima scheme, is looser with the number of syllables. And then finally I've brought another one. This is called the California Dante, which is a big deluxe edition in 3 volumes. And the University of California at Berkeley has a whole online presence about Dante. This is by Alan Mandelbaum, who also was a poet laureate, and he doesn't try to stay with a strict rhyming scheme. So I want to read, obviously not a whole canto from each translation, but some famous lines and see how we can get a different flavor of what's going on here. Now I'm going to start in Dante's Italian. I'm not going to go very far with it. Let's call it 9 lines, 10 lines. And you can get a flavor. This is not modern Italian, obviously. This is medieval Italian. You can criticize my accent if you like. But we can get a flavor for how it works just in terms of sound. Then as we look at the translations and the choices the translators have made, you can start deciding whether they are succeeding in terms of sound, and you can start deciding how these different translations are making particular statements. Without really knowing the Italian, you're not going to get in arguments tonight as to whether this is a more accurate translation or not. Now, we run into the same problem in the Bible, right? And so when we get to the Bible, we have to decide, are we going to try to translate word by word, phrase by phrase, thought by thought? And we get very different approaches. If we look at the Revised Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version that come out of sort of the King James translation tradition, they're trying to do things word by word. NRSV gets really tripped up because it tries to have inclusive pronouns, and so it makes verbs plural that are not plural in the original by making things they rather than he, for example. The NIV, a very popular translation, particularly in evangelical circles, tries to do things more phrase by phrase. Some of the newest translations are more paraphrases, thought by thought. The Revised English Bible, which is from the 50s, it tries it more thought by thought. And if you just put these next to each other, you start noticing very considerable differences. So this is a problem that happens in all translations. It's more of a problem in poetry, right? And so let's play with this. So we start out at the very beginning of the book, and Dante begins, Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Ahi quando al dir qual era e cosa dura, esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, che nel pensier rinnova la paura. Tanta è amara che poco è più morte, ma per trattar del ben di chi vi trovai, dirò dell'altre cose chi vo scorte. Now, let's try Sayers first, because she's the one who's trying to follow the scheme. Midway, let me start again. I'm thinking of Ciardi. Okay. Midway, this way of life we're bound upon, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right road was wholly lost and gone. Ay me, how hard to speak of it, that rude and rough and stubborn forest, the mere breath of memory stirs the old fear in my blood. Notice you have to take rude and blood and act like they rhyme, right? It is so bitter, it goes nigh to death. Yet there I gained such good that, to convey the tale, I'll write what else I found therewith. Now again, you have to break lines up and make them end differently to make the sound pop up at the end with a line that's moving to the next line, basically. Ciardi. Midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood. How shall I say what wood that was? I never saw so drear, so rank, so arduous a wilderness. Its very memory gives a shape to fear. Death could scarce be more bitter than that place, but since it came to good, I will recount all that I found revealed there by God's grace. Different way the line is moving here. He's writing more in sentences that are going to a next line, but if you read it as poetry and stop on the last word, you can make it rhyme. Now finally, let's try Allen Mandelbaum, who does start out in the first stanza here with an ABA scheme, but then doesn't stay with it. And he changes from nostra, our way of life, it becomes singular to make it work here. So, when I had journeyed half of our life's way, I found myself within a shadowed forest, for I had lost the path that does not stray. Ah, it is hard to speak of what it was, that savage forest dense and difficult, which even in recall renews my fear, so bitter, death is hardly more severe. But to retell the good discovered there, I'll also tell the other things I saw. I cannot clearly say how I had entered the wood. I was so full of sleep just at the point where I had abandoned the true path. Now, again, very different rhythms here. Meaning is not totally different at all. We were playing with English a little bit to get it about the same meaning of what Dante's doing here. If we do that and start playing with it ourselves, whatever translation you might decide to work with, just take one and run with it. But every now and then look at another just to say what's going on here, or look at the notes from another and see what commentary. Now, this edition of Sayers, for example, starts with a 69-page small print introduction. It's basically each one of the volumes is like this, and it explains how this works in scholastic theology. And and there are illustrations for how things work. And at the end of each canto, there are very detailed notes that talk about the images that are encountered, that talk about particular lines, and how, for example, this discussion of a star relates to a medieval understanding of astronomy, things of that sort. Ciardi's translation, his commentary is more, a big long paragraph at the beginning of each canto that says, here's what's going on here and what you need to know about. Who's the greyhound that is referred to here by Virgil, when Virgil says, until the greyhound appears. The California commentary is something you have to go and find at the back. It's like a series of endnotes and things, and there's a little bit of an introduction, very minor on each one. Now, if you go to the California website, there's you can click on any one line and start pulling up details on what's going on in that line. And so some people follow what's called the Dante in a Year project, where you go through all the Divine Comedy in a year and get educated in medieval theology and symbolism and all these other things of that sort. Hillsdale College in Michigan is a very good, go from there. Comments or questions in terms of what we've talked about Dante and his image of the devil?
Yes, I was terribly disappointed
How so?
that Satan's role is fixed in the ice, and he beats its 3 sets of wings to send a cold wind through the lowest,
Cocytus,
yes,
the lowest part of hell.
And while modern Christians can certainly cheer him as he gnaws on Judas Iscariot, Brutus and Cassius, as the other arch villains of all time, left me a little,
Bit of a stretch.
yeah, a little disappointed that that's all he could come up with.
Well, let's
we
take
didn't
each
have
one of
dinner
those
and all yet.
points. First thing we notice about Dante's depiction of Satan is that Satan is as close to a thing as you can get. He's an automaton. He has no will that is being expressed. This is very different from the picture of Satan we get in Milton, with the brooding Satan who's sort of the romantic hero who hasn't been worn down.
But
Ver-
even the little devils on the higher levels.
They're machines, right?
No, they go around and they police things and they walk up to you if you're looked out of place and say, what are you doing here and all that.
Right, they're more active.
Yeah.
But they have a role to fill where you don't get a personality for any of the devils until you get to the incident where the one bridge to the next Malbolge has collapsed, and the devil Malacoda, which means bad tail or bad rear end, really, shows up. And Dante sort of engages in some farce there and has Malacoda summon his fellow imps of hell by trumpeting with his behind. And so we get some personality around Malacoda. The rest of them are all, things that automatically slice you, dice you, special wines and things of that sort.
But it doesn't even seem that that Satan keeps the other levels of hell in line. It sounds like he's being the most punished, if you will, and that heaven keeps the other levels of hell in line by sending angels.
Bingo. That's what Dante's trying to do. The devil is not the one who regulates hell. The divine plan does. The devil is now a thing there. If we go through purgatory and paradise, we see how everything revolves around one plan with the different heavens spinning in this way, and the devil at the fixed point in the center is the absolute point of negation, not a power of evil. Not
even the devil that we're introduced to in the Bible passages.
Exactly.
Whether as the serpent or the accuser in Job or anywhere else along the
He
line.
has a personality.
Right.
Yeah. And so to
So
make
it's-
his theology work, to make the Thomistic scholastic theology work, Dante gives us a very different portrait of the devil. What do we do with the fact that that is a portrait that is in some conflict with Scripture? With the devil who shows up and tempts Jesus, with the devil who walks in front of the Lord's court and accuses Job and things of that sort. I'm reasonably certain there are a bunch of dissertations written on this topic, but you raise a good question.
Well, and as I read through hell, I'm almost through purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
Read through hell, it kind of seems to be, truly an allegory to try to explain this is what people need to do or avoid, to find favor.
Yeah, because the punishment that somebody receives in hell is the punishment they've basically made for themselves in their behavior on earth. And so if you're consumed by lust, the hellish experience is lust out of control, where you're consumed by it in flame, basically.
Lust is in purgatory.
Lust is purified in purgatory, and so they have to pass through fire in purgatory. But we get at the very beginning of hell, in one of the sins of the leopard, the first real characters we encounter after Charon and the people in limbo are Francesca da Rimini and Paolo, who are lovers, adulterers, right? And they're real people who are talking to Dante, and they're always being in a whirlwind, constantly tossed about because they allow their passions to sweep them away.
guess it was terribly unclear what the difference between them and those that are in the highest rung of purgatory is.
One is eternal and the other is temporal. And one is a purifying fire that prepares one to ascend to paradise.
Well, the people in purgatory seems like they're there for centuries and
Long
they
time,
don't
right?
think, they don't think or know if they're gonna get to move up. And B, they seem dependent on the prayers of the people to give, put points on their scoreboard so that they
Which is
can.
how we get in trouble, right? By the time Johannes Tetzel is running around
Got
raising
it.
money to get people further advanced in purgatory, Luther is going to freak out, right?
Well, and the other thing is that it seems a very pre-Lutheran treatise on
Oh, it is.
Catholicism.
Oh, it very much
You
is.
know,
Yeah, this is
and
even before the Council of Trent,
even-
or the Lateran Council.
I just can't imagine, even in lust on purgatory, you're allowed to be there even if you had, there was the natural and the unnatural lusters
Mm-hmm,
were running around in purgatory.
right, because they can
But
be
they're
saved.
gonna, well,
They're
so
being
it
saved
seemed
if
to
they're in
me that it
purgatory.
was, I think it was very progressive, I guess, for 1300 to
Mm-hmm.
think that, unnatural sex would not just be a slam dunk, you're in hell and you stay in hell.
Well, that's an important theological statement in classical
It is
Catholicism,
a
that there is
huge one.
no sin that can't be forgiven if it's truly offered to God. And
I just don't, is there?
the other thing that troubles us as modern Christians is what's with Brutus and Cassius, right?
Right.
And so, for example, if these are traitors to Caesar, and we think of the Roman Empire as the
It's a
supreme
competing god,
persecutor of the church, and the emperor setting himself up as a false god. We have to make a couple allowances for what Dante's doing here. He is very much in the medieval scheme that government is ordained by God. It's a top-down model. And so the empire, even with all its imperfections, is instituted from on high. Now, Paul says that we are, as good Christians in the letter to the Romans, to obey the civil authorities, even though the civil authorities are doing what? Persecuting people. Paul's going to be killed by the same civil authorities. Would he write that 10 years later? We could debate that, right? But the traitors here, Brutus and Cassius, are traitors to Julius Caesar. And if we're going to cut Julius Caesar any slack, the divine cult of the emperor does not arise until after his death. He's the one who brings about pretty much the downfall of the republic and gets proclaimed as emperor. But it's not until Augustus that we get the emperor being proclaimed as divine. And so if we were to give Dante truth serum here, I think part of his argument would be the empire that was persecuting the Christian church was a corruption of the empire as originally instituted. And so Brutus and Cassius were traitors to supreme authority in their temporal lord. He had to come up with somebody to deal with the three supreme traitors here, right? To make his scheme work. I don't know who else we would have come up with. Let's just think from a biblical perspective. Could we, suppose we were to sit there and say, well, let's pick, Absalom and say he's tried to overthrow his father.
Yeah, but
Except David's lamenting him, Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I were dead, right? So we can't exactly use Absalom as an example. So if you
There's some pretty rough customers in the all through the Old Testament.
agreed, but are they traitors to their supreme lord?
Well, but, I mean, I just can't get when I read it, and I don't have a very good, grasp of, or it's a 40-year-old, when I looked at it at all, looking at medieval, seems to me that it's a nationalistic
Yep.
event, that
Yep.
we're really not picking the three, or the second and third greatest sinners of all time to Christianity. We've gotta pick somebody that they see steadily.
Well, we could sit there and say, we're dealing in, 1315, about when the poem is being written, 14th century. And so the only empire being separated, the only empire that anybody recognizes is the Roman Empire.
Right.
And so it's been corrupted, it's fallen. We've got this thing called the Holy Roman Empire, which we can famously agree is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? It's a German kingdom. But Dante's setting these things up as ideals. And so he's saying in an eternal scheme, this is the empire. Even though the empire itself had its problems and its bad leaders and its divine cult and fell, and it fell because it was judged for that reason. Now, if I was going to sit there and say, let's come up with other candidates for, really bad guys at the bottom of hell, I might come up with a different list. I think we all might come up with different lists. And
I think it's.
we might put Simon Magus in one of the mouths and say he's the one who's trying to buy the Holy Spirit from Peter and James? Yeah, I forget, but
Or
Peter
what
at
about,
any rate in Acts.
Pilate, I mean.
You could put Pontius Pilate, but he is in the bottom, right? You've got Pilate down there, you've got Judas, you could put Simon Magus. Simon Magus does show up there, but not in the devil's jaws.
Yeah.
And so the idea here is we've gone through the sins of the leopard, sins of incontinence, to sins of the lion, sins of anger, malice, to the sins of the wolf that are all involving some level of fraud or treason. And so we've got the final worst treason is the worst traitors, right? Sins to their lords. In the top-down scheme, the worst kind of sin is to betray your Lord. I mean, I can see why he did it. I can see why it doesn't make sense from a 21st century Christian perspective.
Yeah.
But from a 14th century Catholic perspective in the West, you can see how it makes sense.
I think it makes the best sense as a 14th century Catholic in Italy.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know that he wrote this for anyone else other than the people in Florence,
Yeah. Which,
and-
I mean, he's pronouncing some of this sort of as a judgment on his enemies in Florence.
But, I mean, he was really, UGLY about some of the popes. I mean, get your head cut off ugly about some of them.
Oh, yeah, and in fact, until well into the 20th century, in a lot of Catholic schools, you couldn't study Dante because he put a pope in hell.
There were several, weren't there?
Yeah, there was more than one,
Yeah.
yeah.
So.
And, I mean, the levels of corruption that we could point to in various.
Very last canto was a big letdown after a really interesting sightseeing safari through, But I mean, we talked about it last time, Ulysses on the level 8, why wasn't he up in the first one, because he only tricked the bad guys, or at least, if we read the.
If we're talking about tricksters, what do we do with some of the patriarchs who are
Well, what about-
wily characters in the
How
Old
did Cain and
Testament?
Abel get up, I mean,
Yeah, what do
there's
we
a-
do with Moses passing off Sarah as his sister? In order, and so there are lots of things that happen with
Well,
Old
if God
Testament
says do
figures.
it, I guess but.
Sure, if God
so,
says do
yeah.
it, right? But well, I think what we can agree about Dante's scheme is from the reference point that he's writing, it works. poetically, it works as a theological construct, it works as a get your own back. And if he ever thought he was going to get out of exile and be welcomed back, writing that would have guaranteed that wasn't going to happen, right?
Oh, right, I think he's
Burning his bridges at that point.
He's that upset with the status quo.
When the flood hit Florence in 1966 and really ravaged the city and destroyed countless works of art and manuscripts and things of that sort, within a week it was referred to as Dante's Revenge. And it's,
Like I say, obviously, having gone through several books in the Iliad in Greek, and I realize that it's would be much different if you could go through it in the medieval Italian. But I was a little disappointed in the final.
Well, let me ask you a question. We've discussed before how, as you read through the Divine Comedy, hell is clearly very colorful. There's a lot of description going on.
Right.
Purgatory is pretty descriptive too. Paradise gets a little bit more ethereal. How do you describe some things? You're not there yet, but you're in the middle or end of purgatory.
Right.
How would you compare the two volumes so far, just from a literary point of view?
Well, you know, the people in purgatory seem, you know, I mean, the people in hell, some of them are truly tormented and would repent, except that they didn't do it while they were alive.
They don't get a chance, right?
They don't get a chance. And we kind of scratch our head about that, but nobody in purgatory has their eye on the ball. Most of the people that you encounter in purgatory are not clear that they're gonna ever get out of purgatory.
But they're in a hurry, because purgatory is temporal. At the last judgment, purgatory goes away, heaven and hell don't, right? And so they're always racing around the mountain to get to the next level.
Well, there was that's just the sloth level, right, where they're running the whole time. But it seems to me that, you know, there's no assurance of salvation. Obviously, our 21st century Calvinists, you know, if you ask God to save you, then you are saved, period, full stop. You know, it's not something that you need
That's
to go
not
through.
medieval Catholicism,
Well,
right?
I get it, I get it, but, you know, no one you encounter has any idea if they're gonna get out of purgatory or not. They all seem to be hoping for a miracle or somebody on
But there's
earth
hope,
to-
right? In hell,
Right,
we
the
say,
ones-
lay aside all hope, you that go in
Yeah.
by me. In purgatory, they have hope that they are being saved, can be saved, that God's mercy is that infinite. So,
Well, yeah, I liked, obviously, the Hill was a lot more, fun to read, but obviously you do need the footnotes, the cliff notes to try to help explain the people that you don't know.
who is
from
this person?
Either
Yeah.
antiquity or, and the interweaving of the modern and the ancient villains seems, I don't know, haphazard. He just sprinkles in the greatest hits from his life, people that have fighting him.
If we were sitting here in 21st century America, and we wanted to write the Divine Comedy now, we'd have some characters we put in there, right?
Oh, man,
Lots of characters.
we ought to try to do that in a year.
Yeah, and we some that we wouldn't, we'd have some that we wouldn't name. And so we might talk about the woman with the lampshade made of human skin.
Oh, cool.
And we'd, find a footnote saying we're referring to Commander Hirsch's wife at Auschwitz or something like that, and she saw a tattoo she wanted on her lampshade, that sort of thing.
Again, or
We could talk about famous serial killers who were cannibals and name them. We could talk about the Moors murders with Myra Hindley and others, where they were taping their victims on a tape recorder as they killed them. You know, we could talk about Hitler. We could talk about all kinds of Nazis: Pol Pot, Stalin, Lavrenti Beria. You know, we could populate hell pretty quickly, right? But let's say we wanted to take somebody as an example of a supreme traitor. Now we'd get into all kinds of debates, because first we'd have to say, in order to be a supreme traitor, you'd have to be a traitor to supreme authority. And you'd have to say that the authority itself was legitimate. So even if you said that Count von Stauffenberg was kind of a hero for trying to kill Hitler, you'd say, well, Hitler wasn't a legitimate authority, so we couldn't put von Stauffenberg in hell anyway, right? We'd say he
Well,
was...
it's kind of like Ulysses, if you ask me.
Yeah, exactly. And so who would we name as supreme traitors in our day and age? And even if you came up with the names of famous traitors, and you'd say, that doesn't really fit, you know? I mean, or you get very partisan.
Yeah.
And you'd, have to like sort of canonize somebody and say, well, John Wilkes Booth, since he killed Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln was kind of like a secular saint, we're going to, put John Wilkes Booth down in the bottom of hell or something like that.
Yeah.
You'd never get agreement on this. I think we can be pretty certain that Dante never ran these names by anybody else, even in his day and age. This was just his pick of who fits where. Might be an interesting homework exercise to sit there and say, take one canto from Inferno, pick one, and with reference to our modern knowledge of the last couple centuries, substitute names and see who you come up with. That would be an interesting exercise to do sometimes, and it might also be an interesting psychology test to see who
Well,
we
but-
decide is
but
really.
The problem is that, the ones that he sews in from his contemporary Florentine, feudal Italy life have
No relevance to us,
almost no cognitive,
which is why we need all these notes.
corollary, right, no corollary in our modern,
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, obviously, not saying that it written in meter and it rhyming scheme does not make it, one of the top epic poems of all eternity. Got it. I get that. It's just.
It's a tough read.
Seems to me like it reads more like it's written for somebody then, not necessarily somebody that would come later.
The way we make it timeless is to the extent that we agree and or disagree with how it embodies theology, with how it depicts afterlife, with how it depicts a cosmic, what redemption looks like by the time we get to paradise, and how, for example, as Dante gets more and more focused on the beauty of Beatrice's face, she has to point out to him that it's not her beauty he's reacting to, it's that he's getting closer to God, the source and summation of all beauty, and he's seeing reflected beauty. And so how we experience beauty as a gateway to God becomes part of the point.
Well, certainly there's a almost, who were the guys from the, what is it, when you say that the world is a big clock and set in motion?
Oh, the deists, right? Yeah.
Well, but the mechanical workings of the universe,
Mhm.
guys. I mean, this almost, I know it predates it by 3 centuries, but it almost has a.
Oh, you're talking about the Greek ones. I'm talking about the ones in
No, I'm talking about 16th.
18th century, yeah.
17th century.
Yeah.
Mechanistic,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that God wound the clock and.
Is
set it
not
on the-
intimately involved in our lives. He
You
just
know,
sort of
it's
set
just-
it up and it runs,
But-
yeah.
But that in our modern, and in my Calvinist, you know, that gets 0 points.
Mhm.
You know, that, in Dante, that's important. If you violate that, you've sinned against God.
Well, let's be careful. Dante is very careful about pointing out how this works, kind of like clockwork.
Right.
But God is intimately involved in the lives of individuals
that,
and
but-
souls. Yeah.
Well, it's like saying that, you know, God sanctioned Caesar to be, and that's why Brutus and Cassius are such.
Dante's basically making that argument, that
He
this is a top-down
and-
model, and so if you kill Caesar, you're a real traitor. Alia jacta est. The die is cast, what Caesar says when he crosses the Rubicon, right? And I've seen that used as a motto by a family. But you're like, okay, you know.
Well, I mean,
Well, let's
certainly
switch
I've gotten a lot
gears.
more out of it reading it now and
Good.
spending some time with it, you know, and having the annotations that I did not have or were much thinner, and I didn't have as much time to sit and dig through when I read it in college, you know, for a class out of another however many, 15 books we're supposed to read in a
Mhm.
semester.
Cliff Notes.
Yeah. I mean,
What is
certainly,
that?
I wanted to read it as much as I could, but I couldn't sit down and,
Yeah, there wasn't time.
You have to absorb material
Too
and
busy
regurgitate
partying.
it for a paper or a test. You know, it's college, right?
you know,
But,
anyway.
let's switch gears. We're actually at the halfway point, so we'll take a quick break, and then we'll switch gears and come back and talk about C.S. Lewis and the Screwtape Letters. Keep getting texts here, excuse me. I've been going back through Chardy since we started this course, being pretty familiar with Sayers, and I'm enjoying it. But I have to periodically go and get Sayers' notes out, you know, and John Ciardi used to be on National Public Radio in the 80s.
Oh, really?
He'd come and comment on poetry. It's back when Garrison Keillor would also read
Oh, yeah.
poetry,
Mhm.
and then they'd have Ciardi say something about it. He was, John Ciardi had been a bombardier in a B-17 in World War II, and he would always bring in some aspect of 8th Air Force lore and being a POW and things of that sort, so. Okay, so We're switching gears here now, and we're talking about C.S. Lewis, the Screwtape Letters. We've talked about this for a couple of weeks in terms of saying, try to get a hold of a copy and read through it. We're obviously not going to go through the book. Last week, we talked about, in aspects of diabolical activity, the idea of misdirection and redirection, right? Rather than direct temptation to evil. Redirect, keep the subject of temptation distracted, surround him or her with noise, make them think that what they're choosing is good, things of that sort. Now, the book itself was written during World War II, and it was written as a series of 31 letters with one sort of epilogue that were published weekly in a religious newspaper. Once they were collected and published as a book in 1942, there were a number of people who always wanted Lewis to do more. And he did, in fact, come out with another short work in 1954 called Screwtape Poses a Toast. He did that as an address he gave to some large literary gathering. I forget which one. He never wrote any more on it, but lots of other people have. One of the things I brought with me, I actually printed out the Wikipedia article on the Screwtape Letters, not on Lewis, but on the Screwtape Letters. And the reason I did that was it gives me lists here of stage adaptations, comic book adaptations, audio dramas, annotated Screwtape Letters, how Screwtape shows up in popular culture, in comics, in documentaries, in literature, for example, in the Marine Corps Gazette, in music. And then it goes on about political discourse. It gives us all kinds of citations of literary sequels by other people. And I haven't counted all these up, but it looks like there are about 20. There's some names you'll recognize on the list. For example, the philosopher Peter Kreeft shows up in 1998 with the Snakebite Letters, devilishly devious secrets for subverting society as taught in Tempter's training school. We have the Wormwood Letters by a fellow by the name of Brian Miles. We have the Gargoyle Code by Dwight Longenecker. We have the Michael Letters. There are all kinds of, the conceit of the letters here of instructing a junior devil have been used by others. Now, Kreeft has also done things like bring, famous pagan philosophers together with the Apostle Paul, and they have, a colloquy over something. Or modern philosophers with apostles or things like that. And he's very clever with that. Kreeft is very clever about making quite subtle philosophical and theological points accessible to people in ways that are fun to read. He has a whole book where he basically takes the provincial letters by, I'm blanking, Blaise Pascal now, and annotates them as a manual for modern Christians. Very well done. Lewis is kind of a pioneer of this sort of genre, though. And so the letters are letters addressed by a senior devil, Screwtape, to his nephew, Wormwood. It's never made clear how a devil can have a nephew. This presumes some level of familial relations, and that's never made clear. All of the letters are addressed to Wormwood as, "My dear Wormwood," and then they end with "affectionately yours," or "your affectionate uncle, Screwtape," except at the end, when we get there. And that's when Wormwood ultimately gets condemned and will be destroyed because he has at some point acknowledged God's sovereignty, which is the crime that will really get you canceled in the upside down hierarchy of hell. And so the last letter, rather than my dear Wormwood, is addressed, my dear, my very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pigsny, and is signed, your increasingly and ravenously affectionate uncle, Screwtape, because Wormwood will be eaten by the other devils. Now, Screwtape always refers to the person who is being tempted by Wormwood as the patient. So he's getting progress notes on the patient. And Wormwood will ask questions about this. He refers to our Father, meaning the devil. He refers to God as, the adversary or
The enemy.
the enemy. Everything is upside down. So the further you're down in hell, the more power you have. Things. This is a quite different scheme from Dante. But if we look at how Wormwood is to tempt the patient, we find out, first of all, that the patient is fairly young. It's never made clear why he is not subject to national service, because it is during warfare, and his wife is worried about him being conscripted. It seems by the end of the book that we figure out that the patient is either a medical student or a young doctor, and so he's exempt to engage in national service on the home front. One of the things that the devil is supposed to do with the patient, what's the most important rule? Does anybody who's read Screwtape remember what the most important rule is? That you must never, ever, ever permit the patient to do. You must interfere with on any basis possible. Don't let them pray.
Oh, yeah.
Don't let him pray, right? Because now he's going to invoke the holy name. Now he's going to make his heart available to God, the enemy, in some different way. You have to distract him from that. It could be with noise. It could be with busyness. It could be with anxieties. Keep him very busy. Now, let's just take that microscopically brief preface. Go back to what we talked about last week about misdirection, redirection, and start looking at 2024 America. Our culture, what is one of the things that our culture particularly values? Multitasking, right? And as soon as you're trying to do...
Say Donald Trump.
Well, it could be, we could get political answers to that too, right? If we want to talk.
All the answers are going to be Donald Trump.
Well,
2024.
and we're going to sit there and say multitasking is a thing that is actively promoted in certainly how the business culture has taken over part of the wider culture. And so one of the things I notice writing a couple times a week sort of blog-like thing, a Substack, is without fail, as soon as I sit at the computer and start trying to think in a structured way and put the words on paper, the phone starts to go off. It could be with a text, it could be with a phone call, it could be spam, it could be something real. But as soon as the text goes off, what are we trained to do?
Answer.
See what it is, right? See what it is. We're trained to respond to that screen. Now, we're old enough in this room to remember somebody saying something like, they're holding a phone up, it's important, it's long distance, right? You're supposed to
Yes.
run and answer the phone, it's long distance and that sort of
Costing
thing.
money.
Yeah.
Right, now it's like, what's long distance? Nobody even knows, you don't even dial a 1 anymore to dial
If you
it.
use Magic Jack, you have to buy prepaid minutes to call Europe.
Right. Or you buy a calling plan on, your phone when you go to Europe so you don't get shafted on,
The ceasefire plan is terrible.
I agree. The one we had actually on, what are we on for? Was actually pretty cheap.
It's better.
Yeah, we got 2 phones for like a month in Spain for like $100, and so it was well worth it.
And got the internet access
Mm-hmm.
without the
Wi-Fi calling,
Talk.
things like that. Yeah,
Wi-Fi call, but yeah, it's just,
but multitasking, even if we're at, well, let's take the example of a physician nowadays, right? In a clinical setting, one of the things that a physician has to respond to in addition to the patient is the prompts from whatever computer program, whether it's Epic or something like Epic, that has to be filled in about the patient, which might have an effect on how carefully you can pay attention to clinical signs. We've certainly seen that happen in some clinical settings. ERs are notorious now on the basis of protocols and evidence-based medicine that when you're dealing with patient X for this set of signs and symptoms, somebody is putting another indicator in front of you. It could be an EKG or something, because under the stroke protocol, we have to do it in this time, right? A prosaic example, perhaps. If you're a lawyer and you sit there and, well, I'll go back to when I was practicing law. What first changed things was the fax machine.
Oh.
Because it used to be you'd get a set of pleadings in the mail or a brief from somebody, and you'd look at it. And it might sit there a couple days, or you get an inquiry from a client, and you'd be thinking about it. You might be doing a little research. You might be getting a book out and thinking about it. You might be talking about it with a colleague. Once the fax showed up, now people started expecting an answer like, you can get back to me.
Pronto.
You know, like now. Once the internet started doing that with, you're sending documents as attachments to emails, all bets are off. Once texts started showing up in the meantime, while you're sitting there waiting in court, while somebody else is testifying, your text is going off and sitting there and, one of the things I have noticed I haven't practiced law since, the early 90s, so almost 30 years. And if I look at legal pleadings now, or briefs, at an appellate level, I'll sit there and read, a brief before the Supreme Court of Mississippi, for example, and I'm appalled at the level of writing.
Yeah.
And also what you find, I just was talking to a lawyer yesterday was going through trial briefs because he's starting a trial today. And one of the courts in this state had cited an opinion from the Tennessee Supreme Court as authority for Proposition X. There was no controlling law in Mississippi. And if you go and you read the opinion of the Tennessee Supreme Court, they say, the rule could be X and Y and Z. But if you keep reading the opinion, they don't say it is X and Y and Z. They go and they reject that option and rule against that option. And it turned out when he dug into this particular thought about who was filing the brief, that the brief had been written by an AI, by a chatbot, that had picked up that text from that Tennessee Supreme Court opinion and run with it. Now, that's malpractice, okay? But it's becoming more and more common. Or you find that basics of grammar just aren't working in legal pleadings. And so one of the things that you're supposed to be able to do as a lawyer, particularly in litigation, is use language and think in some structured fashion. Without even knowing the lawyers involved in that case, or the lawyer who was filing that brief in that case, you'd have to sit there and say, is he just dumb? Is he lazy? Or is he pulled in so many different directions that it's like, yeah, that works. It helps my case. There's no controlling law in Mississippi. I'm going to cite it. Again, you can get sued for that eventually, right? What other examples would we come up with? We've talked about lawyers and doctors. What about teachers multitasking, right? What about business people multitasking? What about if you go to try to get an answer from somebody in goods and services where you're a customer and you have a problem. It's going to be run according to a particular protocol that's tracking you. And so our minds are getting retrained to use protocols that are being imported from outside our minds. Would that, if Lewis was writing in 2024, be one of the things that Screwtape might be advising the junior devil to do? Make it all about how procedures work so that you can rewire a brain a little bit. You can find people arguing now that, the whole bit about AI and all the things we're doing with computers is designed to change human consciousness, to make us subject to diabolical temptation. You can find some weird stuff out there with people talking about. And you will find people in the AI community saying that they're getting in touch with something that seems to be a different being. Now, if you believe that or not, if it's even possible, I'm scared, right? At what point can we make a rational, informed distinction between whether we're talking to an AI or a human being? There's an article in today's, and this is becoming quite normal to a lot of people. We have the first generation of people in college now who's been raised on one of these. Having taught high school recently, I can tell you that people have been rewired a little bit and also have to have that screen around. So if we take Lewis's model here of redirecting, misdirecting, reprogramming in effect, when we're multitasking, is it more difficult or not to pray?
Oh, much more difficult.
If we look at classical ascetical theology about prayer, what is one of the things we're supposed to do in prayer? Clear our mind of these other things, right? We have to be really, really intentional about space, time, routine, all these things that you'd find in a monastery, for example, in order to reject what are called logismoi in ascetical theology. Logos is what? Word in Greek, right? Logismoi is distracting thoughts. And so they're even referred to in the Temptation of St. Anthony as devils, that these are distracting thoughts that come to you. How do you clear your mind from that in order to pray becomes a challenge that the Rule of Benedict tries to address. But if we use prayer as an example and you start saying, we're living in a multitasking world, whether we want to or not, do we start saying with Rod Dreher that we sort of have to withdraw from the world more in sort of the Benedict option and live in intentional communities where we pray together and set aside time and, or how are we in the world and not of the world? That's kind of what we're struggling with, right? Because the world keeps trying to make us what? More worldly. And more worldly now involves more distraction. If you go with Lewis's model, more distraction means more temptation. Now, one other thing that Lewis does not discuss that current literature, like Rod Dreher's book on Living in Wonder, does discuss, and there are a couple other contemporary works that do, is the problem with psychedelic drugs. One of the things that we have seen in this course, and even the Commonwealth of Massachusetts just rejected the legalization of psychedelics, but one of the things we've seen in this course is that if you summon the devil, he's obliged, he's not obligated, but he'll generally show up in some form, right? If you try to summon a dark power, they'll be happy to oblige, right? And so there's some doors you don't want to open, whether it's, trying to do divination with, some kind of stupid occult ritual. Occult is growing quite rapidly in this country. If you're taking a psychedelic drug, one thing that's probably happening, and we could talk about the neurochemistry of this, is your brain's becoming more porous to stimuli, or at least reacting to stimuli differently, right? Is it becoming more porous to outside influences? Or is this all just an internal chemical thing? When people describe psychedelic experiences, they're attempting to get into an ecstatic state. Some of them describe meeting other beings in these ecstatic states, some of which seem wonderful and some of which seem very threatening. Whether or not you believe those beings are real supernatural beings or just something happening in the person's brain, what we do see with increased use of psychedelic drugs, and more with the powerful cannabis that's available now, is greater and greater levels of psychosis and greater levels of neurosis and various anxiety disorders. If you throw onto that the COVID lockdown in that age cohort, and throw into that this sort of screen addiction that puts you into a different consciousness and is rewiring things there. If you were the enemy, the adversary, Satan, whoever you want to name here, and you weren't writing in 1941 about how to do this, could you come up with a better way? If you stipulate with systematic theology that the devil can't compel you to do anything, he has to persuade, he has to trick, he has to beguile, he has to redirect, he has to misdirect, but he can't exercise dominion over you except to the extent that you give him your will. So you will find quite a bit of literature out there if you look for it. Rod Dreher would be an example. Randall Sullivan would be another, who are arguing that everything, now we've always heard this throughout the ages, people arguing about apocalypse, but everything that has been predicted in terms of apocalypse, the conditions are getting better. What is our Christian response to that?
To have faith.
Remain faithful and say you're going to be tried, right? Sifted. Is it a Christian thing to sit there and say, I can be protected and shall be protected from suffering?
None of us are protected from suffering. None of us are really protected from suffering.
Yeah, it's
It's
never
just
been
part of the
Christian
human-
teaching that if you're faithful, you won't suffer,
No.
right? It's been Christian teaching that if you suffer, here's how God will give you the grace to endure that suffering and turn it into something that will give you more grace and increase you in faith and things of that sort. Getting somebody to believe that when they're really suffering is kind of cold comfort. Getting somebody who's in terrible pain chronically to offer their suffering up to God to share in Christ's redemption of the world is a nice idea, but trying to get them to do that is, well, it wouldn't be where you'd start pastorally, let's put it that way, right? It wouldn't get you real far. But if you go back to Marshall McLuhan, what was one of his favorite bits? The medium is the message, right? Now, Marshall McLuhan, in fact, was a devout Catholic who went to Mass. The TV was on, and this changed the way you perceived reality. One of the challenges I faced in a pastoral call in a hospital room with somebody who's sick enough or injured enough to be in a hospital, somebody who might be really far gone, is about the first thing I have to do is turn the television off.
I do it every single time I enter a patient's room.
Exactly.
The first thing I do is turn off the TV and tell everybody that's on a cell phone that has to be turned off, or they can take the call outside.
Exactly. Because if we're going to have a real conversation,
And I've had pushback,
mm-hmm,
and my reaction to that is to say, well, I think our time together is more important than what's on the TV. If you don't think so, I can withdraw from your case and let somebody else have a turn.
usually gets their attention. I have witnessed
I've
in
had
I have
probably a handful
witnessed
of-
in more than one hospital setting a doctor in an ER, for example, trying to get the patient to describe, you've got some symptoms here, explain to me what happened. And the patient is looking at the TV or texting somebody on the phone. And I've seen a physician say, I'm sorry I'm wasting your time. You're obviously not sick if you won't talk to me. So we'll say that you are being discharged. And that will usually reorient the patient. And,
Well,
and
I mean, every now and then the patients want to, talk to somebody that, or, for reinforcement of the facts or just for reinforcement
Fine.
altogether. But I generally don't allow people to have a phone on during the conversation for somebody else to be listening in. And I say, well, it's, if it's not important enough for them to be here, then we'll just have to relay that to them. And, if it goes on, I say, well, my daughter who's in medical school, her generation may have to practice medicine with a camera and a microphone in every clinical setting,
Wow.
recording what's being said. But I think if that comes here, I may go ahead and retire.
I hear you.
But I mean, my daughters may have to put up with that.
It could happen. A lot of things get recorded now. What I do in a pastoral setting is say, if we're going to pray, we have to focus now, or whatever, to actually pray. Even in medieval times, when you don't have electric media, people are getting distracted. And so they have to have a rule in a monastery about how you pray, when you pray, what are the ascetical disciplines to promote that. If we don't make a habit out of this, it's very easy to be distracted, led astray, whatever you want to call it. Now, the other thing that you can almost universally say is when somebody is going to leave the faith, they start by stopping praying. Whatever imperfect prayer habits they've had go away. And that's when it just becomes easier and easier and easier to forget about any concept of faith, God, let alone going to church. So when people lose the ability to pray or the habit to pray, or they don't make themselves pray, they will leave the faith, almost universally. They might come back. There might be something that happens in their life. Often that happens, actually. But once they stop praying, they're pretty much out the door from a church, and probably out the door from any sort of trying to be faithful. They might be trying to be spiritual, and so they're, getting a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and, how I'm spiritual in my own time or something. One of the things that Lewis, of course, has the devil's active in tempting you is to get you away from faith to spiritual, right? Because then spirits are going to show up, and I do a psychedelic drugs, the spirit shows up. But if you're not in the habit of praying, but you say you're spiritual, you're ripe for temptation. Reactions to that? Comments? I might point out, while none of these are pastoral emergencies, I've gotten 8 texts in the last 5 minutes.
A far cry from the frozen devil at the bottom of the
Exactly.
hell in the middle of the earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's flapping his wings and gnawing on 3 arch villains.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all he does. He doesn't speak, he doesn't tell us anything about why he did what he did, or where, to hell with God, or, no rebellion, just, so.
Yeah.
I think we're confronted with a more active screw tape.
Yeah, and I would
Paradigm
really,
than we
even if
are
you've
of-
read this book before, it makes interesting reading in 2024. And it's an easy read. You can go through that book in about a day easily. So I
And it's
would
funny.
commend it to you again. And I would invite you to formulate your own screw tape letter about, now, for example, these websites are gone, probably a good thing. But there used to be a website called Virtue Online that was a very Anglican or angry Anglican presence that was talking about everything that was wrong with the Episcopal Church. There was another one out of Mississippi called Stand Firm in Faith. They were both financed by the same guy who was a member of my parish in Wisconsin.
Oh.
What you would find is occasionally in Virtue Online is the guy, David Virtue, who did the website, would have Screwtape proposes another toast. And it would be about something happening in the church. Now, yesterday, the Archbishop of Canterbury resigned.
I saw that.
And he resigned because of an abuse scandal in the church that had taken place over a number of years. It got reported in 2013. And to him, the abuser died in Africa in 2018. Congregational church, the Roman Catholic Church written large, any church. We do see ongoing examples of abuse. And we do see these breaches of trust. Although if you look statistically, there is no higher level of abusers in, say, the Roman Catholic Church with celibate clergy than with school teachers in public schools. It's about the same ratio. So you can't just blame theology and celibacy. But once you breach that level of trust, I mean, Ireland has basically de-Christianized in one generation because of the way the church basically sort of hid abuse and moved abusers around to different places. We've seen that fundamental breach of trust in a number of places in the United States, whether it's congregational churches or an archdiocese. Once you can get people in authority tempted to very evil actions, you can undermine a whole bunch of faith as well as an institution. So again, writing from a 2024 perspective, if we were the senior devil, we would say to the junior devil that we have to understand that the best way to tempt anybody is to flatter them about how important they are and how their will is paramount and how all of their desires are legitimate so that they can be further and further as now. So he's not using that as an example. But